Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Greek beef stuffed onions. That's right, I've stuffed a lot of things. Cabbage, peppers, squash, my face, but I've never stuffed onions. And what follows is what I thought was a very delicious first attempt. And to get started, the first thing I did was add half my ground beef to a skillet set over medium-high heat, in which I'd added a generous amount of olive oil. And I had two main goals here. One was to break the meat up into nice small crumbles. And then I also wanted to get a little bit of browning happening on the beef. And the reason I'm doing this with only half my meat is because I wanted to try something new. Okay, I usually prefer the texture of a stuffing when raw beef is used. But stuffings made with beef that's browned first actually do have more flavor. So I'm always torn between which way to go. So I decided to combine raw and cooked, just to see what would happen. And we will cover that later. But for now, once our beef is browned, we can go ahead and add some diced onion, along with some freshly ground black pepper, some salt of course, followed by a few shakes of cayenne. And what we'll do is cook that stirring for a few minutes until our onions start to turn translucent and maybe start to take on a little bit of golden brown color. And once things are looking a little something like this, we can toss in our next set of ingredients, which includes a whole bunch of minced garlic, a generous spoon of dried oregano, followed by a couple tablespoons of tomato paste. And what we want to do is stir all this together, and we will keep stirring until every piece of onion and crumble of beef is coated in that tomato paste, at which point we'll let it cook for a minute or two, or until our mixture looks like this. And once it does, we will stop and toss in some raw rice, which for me is basmati, but I think any long grain rice would work, or really any rice for that matter. And what we'll do is give that a thorough mix, since we want all those grains of rice to be coated with the olive oil and that rendered beef fat, and any and all other goodness in the pan. And once we feel that's happened, we will stop and add a splash of red wine vinegar, as well as a cup or so of chicken broth. And we'll reduce our heat to medium, and then we will cook this stirring until our rice has absorbed all the liquid. And by the way, this part was also an experiment for me. Okay, when I do things like cabbage rolls, I almost always use raw rice, since I wanted to absorb the maximum amount of flavor from the other ingredients. But I noticed most of the other recipes for this called for cooked rice, or at least partially cooked rice. So I decided to give it a little bit of a head start here, which theoretically is going to make our stuffed onions take a little less time in the oven. Although as you'll see in here, they still took a very long time. But anyway, like I said, I cooked that until the liquid was absorbed, at which point I turned off the heat, so I could let this cool before adding it to the rest of the filling ingredients. And while we let that cool, let me go ahead and show you how to prep the onions. And for this, I think the best choice is some nice large yellow onions. And what we'll do is slice about an inch off each end. And once that's been accomplished, we will find the exact center of the onion. And with our point of the knife right there, we'll make one cut straight down. And you'll see very soon why this is one of the keys to the whole operation. And that's it. Once cut, we can pull off that papery outside layer. And then I went ahead and did 3 more exactly the same way. At which point I transferred those into a pot filled with some nice cold fresh water, which of course I had generously seasoned with salt. And what we'll do is bring that to a simmer on high heat, at which point we can back it down to medium-low, where we'll maintain a nice steady simmer, and we will cook the onions for about 20 to 30 minutes, depending on the size, or until they soften up enough where we can separate the layers. And since that is going to take a little bit of time, while we're waiting, we might as well finish our filling, which we will start by transferring our now cooled beef and rice mixture into a bowl, to which we will add the rest of our beef in its raw form. I also tossed in a little bit of crumbled Greek feta, which is not traditional, but I figured how is that not going to be good? And then I finished up with a handful of freshly chopped herbs, and I went with the Greek holy trinity of parsley, oregano, and mint, at which point we'll take a spoon and give this a thorough mix. And if you thought rosemary was in the holy trinity of Greek herbs, no, that is actually part of the Holy Quartet. Although having said that, a little bit of rosemary in here would have been fine. So go ahead and add some if you want. I mean, you are after all the Zeus of your herb use. But either way, once that's mixed, we'll keep that in the fridge until we need it. And then we'll head back to the stove to check our onions, which like I said, we need soft enough to separate the layers. And I guess you could, if you want, poke these with a knife or test them with a skewer. But I could see separation happening, and they felt soft enough, so I pulled them out. Oh, and then very important, do not discard the water, since what we'll do with that is transfer 4 cups into a saucepan and along with a few cups of tomato sauce, and maybe some chicken bouillon paste, this will be the liquid we add to our baking dish, in which we're going to be cooking our stuffed onions. And all we need to do to this is bring it up to a simmer on high, and then reduce our heat to low, and keep it hot until we need it. And that's it. Once our onions are cool enough to handle, we will pull out our filling and get to stuffing. And of course, the pieces in the center are probably going to be too small for this, but we can save that stuff to use in like 100 other things. And then instinctively, I figured I should use the longest, biggest pieces, which in hindsight might have been a mistake, because once I eventually transferred in a couple heaping tablespoons of our filling, and then rolled it up, because it overlapped itself, I ended up with like a double layer of onion, which I guess wasn't a big problem, but I do think that's the reason these took longer to cook than I thought. But also, and maybe more importantly, if you use nice big onions like I did, those big outer layers are going to be more fibrous. And even after cooking these for a really long time, after everything was tender, the surface of those outside pieces, believe it or not, actually retained a little bit of firmness. So what I'm trying to say is, you only need enough onion to cover the filling. And to do that, we're probably better off using the middle pieces, which are going to be plenty long enough and probably a little more tender. But anyway, like I said, this was my first time, so I knew going in I was going to learn a few things. And by learn a few things, I mean make a few mistakes. But anyway, eventually I ran out of filling after rolling up 18, at which point I transferred those into my largest baking dish. And yes, as you can see, I ended up tearing up those inside pieces and laying those in the bottom for a little extra onion action. And that's it. We'll transfer in our cooking liquid that we put together earlier, which I probably could have just poured in instead of ladling. But as usual, I was scared to mess up my perfect rows and columns. And then for whatever reason, I decided to transfer this onto a sheet pan, just in case anything bubbles over. And then after that, I placed over a piece of foil, since I think we want to cook this covered for at least the first hour. And that's it. I went ahead and transferred that into the center of a 375-degree oven, where we will cook it until our rice is perfectly tender. And like I said, I did the first hour covered and then pulled off the foil. And I was thinking it would only take me like another 30 minutes uncovered, but I wasn't even close. Okay, my rice was not actually tender until after the 2-hour mark, at which point it looked like this, which I thought was totally worth the wait, since if you're asking me, these things are gorgeous. But to make them even more beautiful, and to give them a little bit of a glisten, I went ahead and drizzled these with olive oil, and then eventually finished them off with another pinch of herb. And after letting them rest for about 10 minutes, which was not easy, I went ahead and served one up and sliced in for the official taste. And yes, my 20-year-old steak knife is super dull, but also, as I mentioned earlier, the outside surface still retains a little bit of firmness, which didn't ruin anything. It just prevented me from getting that perfect slicing shot, where the knife goes through like a hot blade through butter. But anyway, 99% of the onion was sweet and tender, and very, very delicious, and the filling was absolutely outstanding. Okay, I think my trick of browning half the meat really worked, which by the way is not really even an extra step, since we have to saute the onions and pre-cook the rice a little bit anyway. Speaking of which, to cut some cooking time down, next time I'll probably add more stock to the rice when we pre-cook it, so that it's actually starting to get tender when it goes into the stuffing. Since while these really were phenomenal, 2+ hours cooking time is a little much. But anyway, that's it. My take on Salantourmasi. And unless I hear otherwise, I will assume I'm saying that wrong. But no matter how it's pronounced, I absolutely loved how these came out. And I'll finish up the video by serving up 3 in a bowl, which I think would be a perfect portion. And I used a nice sharp serrated knife so I could get a decent cross-section. And as I take one last bite, let me finish up by saying, I really do hope you give these a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.